When we look to evaluate the effectiveness of monetary policy, of course, just like we talked about for fiscal policy, it's important that we keep in mind, well, what does the actual aggregate supply curve look like? Obviously, depending on the shape of the aggregate supply curve, the effectiveness of monetary policy could be quite different. So any question that refers to the shape of aggregate supply, you're going to have to do something like this to show that it might be more or less effective. On the Keynesian curve, of course, we have the three sections, A, which is horizontal, C, which is vertical, and B, which is becoming steeper and steeper as it leads into C. Well, obviously on A, any shift to aggregate demand is going to have no effect on price level, and all the effects are going to be seen in national income. So that would lead us to say that in section A, monetary policy and fiscal policy, any demand-side policy, is going to be very effective at increasing the level of national income or output, and therefore decreasing unemployment. And again, the positive is that's going to come at zero expense because price level isn't going to increase. However, on section C, there are no more possible increases to national income. Therefore, you couldn't lower unemployment anymore if those increases to aggregate demand were happening on area C. However, if you were in area C of the the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, well, then you could decrease aggregate demand to lower price levels, so to fight inflation very effectively. And in the same manner, if you were on area A or section A, you couldn't decrease the price level at all. Now, always in this, especially when we're talking about decreasing the price level, we have to think about, well, are wages and input prices, are they sticky? Because if they are, then obviously using any sort of policy to fight against inflation is going to be relatively ineffective. In area B, in section B, obviously as we get closer and closer to C, well then, the problems and the benefits of section C will be true, and as we get closer and closer to area A, those same arguments will hold true there. Keep something in mind though. If our output is to the left of national income at full employment, it's very unlikely that there's going to be inflationary pressures. It's likely that all we're going to be concerned about is that unemployment is too high, so it seems as if increasing aggregate demand would be very effective until we get to YFE. Likewise, once we're beyond YFE, unemployment is no longer the problem, inflation is, and it's this area of the Keynesian aggregate supply curve where changing the level of inflation is easy because it's more vertical and then of course vertical. Now, of course, that's all based on how we've drawn something, and that may or may not have any sort of connection to the real world. In the neoclassical view, keep in mind for them, the argument is not going to just be that an increase of aggregate demand will lead us to YFE and, a small increase in price. Part of the argument is going to be that the central bank isn't very accurate in its increases to aggregate demand. So it's likely to overshoot YFE, therefore there's going to be a corresponding shift to the left in short-run aggregate supply. So instead of price level just rising to here, it's going to rise all the way up to PL2. So we're going to get a relatively large increase to price level for a relatively small increase to real GDP. Overall, when we evaluate monetary policy, here's some strengths and some weaknesses. One of the major strengths is that because monetary policy really can be changed at any time, it's going to be much quicker than fiscal policy. Remember, fiscal policy can really only be set once a year, so that's a big problem. Well, most central banks are going to have policy meetings at pretty regular intervals. The Fed in the US meets every 6 weeks, but if something happens in between those meetings, they can of course call a meeting whenever they want and change monetary policy right then. So they can be quicker than fiscal policy. Also, they can reevaluate a step they've made. So if they're trying to raise the inflation rate, raise the interest rate to combat inflation, and they've raised the interest rate and inflation is still a little bit too much, they can make, they don't have to double what they did before. Maybe they can just change it by a little bit more. So it can be incremental and you can kind of fine tune the results. Well, at least that's the argument. However, you're always going to have the problem of time lags. We talked about that for fiscal policy. It's true for monetary policy as well. You have to figure out what the economy's doing and then figure out what you want to do. And by that time, maybe if the economy is going into a contraction, maybe that has already built up the momentum, making it harder to fight against. Also a problem is that because monetary policy for interest rates, remember discount rates and changing the reserve requirements are more direct, but for interest rates, because they're working through the market, it's not going to be quite as precise as they would want it to be. That's why they call it's a targeted interest rate as opposed to just saying, here's the new interest rate. So that can be another thing that takes away from or that limits the effectiveness of this strength here. Another strength is that they have political independence. They're not elected, so they don't have to keep anybody happy to keep their job. They can't be reappointed, so making an unpopular choice isn't going to, lose them their job in the future. So that should give them some level of political independence in most cases. Now, some countries don't have that system in place, and the people who are on the central bank do have to respond to what the politicians want. So we always have to ask this question of, well, are they really independent, or how independent are they? Another problem is being independent. Well, is independence actually compatible with democracy? Dictators, they're very independent. They can do whatever they want to do. So if we value democracy and if we value having somebody representing my interests, what I voted for them to do, well, that independence may actually be a negative thing. You'll see, especially with the U.S. Federal Reserve, there's a lot of people who see the U.S. Federal Reserve in a very negative light. Lots of conspiracy theories and lots of people who think that they're just, serving the interests of the rich. And there's some credence to a lot of that. So we have to ask that question of, is independence actually a good thing? There's not going to be any crowding out in this. Remember, crowding out happened with fiscal policy. Well, here, crowding out happened because increased borrowing meant interest rates went up, and that would decrease the amount of consumption and investment. Well, here, because they're actively pushing the interest rate down, it can counteract the effects of crowding out that might be happening because of fiscal policy. But in the same way, you could say, look, these guys are trying to push the interest rate down to stimulate growth, easy monetary policy, which is like expansionary fiscal policy, but at the same time, fiscal policy is making it harder and harder and harder to actually push the interest rates down. Some other weaknesses that we can point out is that monetary policy hasn't been very effective in the last 7 or 8 years. You can see that from 2001 to 2003, interest rates were held low and the economy somewhat recovered. From 2004 to 2006, you see interest rates are going up. That's because the US economy was doing very well during that time. When the Great Recession hit in 2008, we see interest rates are lowered and lowered and lowered, and they're actually lowered to a point where they can't be lowered any further. So at that point, the Fed was sort of out of ammunition. They couldn't do anything else with interest rates. So that's when they brought in these policies called quantitative easing, and you see QE 1, 2, and 3. Without going into too much about quantitative easing right now, what you need to understand is that it somewhat eroded the trust that people have in the US economy. So that can be a negative effect all on its own. Another problem with monetary policy is encapsulated somewhat by this idea of rational expectations. This is a theory that it shows up in lots of different places in economics, and this is probably the only time we mention it. Here's the idea. If the Fed, or the central bank, is going to lower interest rates because the economy is doing poorly, well, they're going to lower interest rates to try to get consumers and businesses to go out and invest. But consumers and businesses, they're smart. They learn from this. Maybe I'm a consumer and I don't think the economy is bad, and I'm going to go buy a house or a car, whatever it might be. But then I see on the television or newspaper or internet, I see that interest rates have been lowered, and I think back to my economics class and I think, well, wait a minute, if they're lowering interest rates, well, then that must mean the economy's bad, so maybe now isn't the best time to buy a car or buy a house or whatever. So, by trying to fight against a recession or a contraction in this case, they actually cause consumption and investment to decrease.